Tonight, we drift back to a world of candlelight, stone castles, and whispered vows beneath the stars. A time when love was bound by faith, class, and duty, yet found ways to bloom in secret corners. Welcome to History for Sleep, where we explore the quieter side of history, made for those who want to learn as they rest, or rest as they learn. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to History for Sleep. It helps this channel grow, and it lets me know you'd like more peaceful stories from the past. And when you have a moment, leave a comment below. Tell me what parts of history you'd like to hear next, and when you usually listen, whether it's while winding down at night or during a quiet afternoon. In this episode, we'll explore what love and intimacy were really like in medieval times. We'll all move past the myths of chivalrous knights and damsels in distress to find the real people who lived behind castle walls and cottage doors. You'll hear how religion shaped desire, how courtly love was both pure and impossible, and how ordinary men and women tried to balance affection with the rules of their world. This story isn't about scandal or shock. It's about understanding how love survived, even when the world made it complicated. So, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's journey together through the gentle, fascinating world of medieval love. To understand what love meant in the medieval world, we have to start with how people thought about being human. The Middle Ages were not just a time of knights and kings, but of faith, superstition, and a deep struggle between the spiritual and the physical. Every feeling, every impulse, and every act was seen as part of a larger moral universe, one where heaven and hell were never far from mind. The body, in many ways, was viewed as both a blessing and a burden. For most people, the church provided the framework for understanding everything, including love. Desire was not seen as something natural or innocent. It was something to be managed, directed, or controlled. To feel too strongly was to risk sin. And yet, even in that world of sermons and confessions, people still fell in love, still longed for touch, and still dreamed of affection. The medieval heart was not so different from ours, though the language and limits of their world made it far more complicated. Philosophers and theologians often wrote that the body was weak, that it pulled the soul toward temptation. Monks copied ancient texts by candlelight that spoke of the conflict between reason and passion. But in the same monasteries where restraint was preached, the pages of illuminated manuscripts sometimes held marginal drawings of lovers, hints of the world that lay beyond cloister walls. Even the holy could not entirely silence the human longing for connection. For ordinary people, love was not a matter of poetry, but of survival. A man's choice of wife, or a woman's choice of husband, was often shaped by family, land, and labor. Feelings came later, if at all. Marriage was less about romance and more about partnership in work and faith. Yet within those unions, affection could grow, and when it did, it was cherished quietly, like a small fire tended against the cold. Still, medieval thought about love was full of contradictions. Priests condemned lust from the pulpit, but poets sang of it in courts. Scholars wrote about the dangers of passion, but nobles exchanged secret gifts and letters that spoke of burning hearts. Even medical writings suggested that love could be both an illness and a cure. It was said that too much longing could cause melancholy, that desire could make one weak or even mad. And yet, just as often, it was claimed that love brought health to the soul, that affection restored balance to the body and mind. The tension between the sacred and the human ran through everything. The medieval person believed they were constantly being watched by God, by neighbors, by family, and this awareness shaped every emotion. To love too openly was dangerous. To hide affection, sometimes even from oneself, was safer. But even under those constraints, love found its way into songs sung in the fields, prayers whispered at night, and dreams that no priest could control. When people spoke of love, they often used the language of service and devotion. To love someone was to honor them, sometimes even to suffer for them. It wasn't the casual emotion we know today. It was something closer to faith itself. The troubadours of southern France described love as a kind of worship, an act that could purify the soul through longing. And while that might sound poetic, it also reflected a deeper truth about the medieval mindset, that the line between the sacred and the sensual was thin and constantly shifting. It is also worth remembering that life in the Middle Ages was hard. Disease, hunger, and war were constant companions. In a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed, emotions burned brightly and briefly. A moment of connection, a shared look, or a simple gesture could carry immense meaning. Love was both fragile and powerful, a reminder of what made life worth enduring. Even within arranged marriages, couples sometimes discovered tenderness. Letters from the period show small expressions of care. A husband writing to his wife from a campaign, a wife praying for her husband's safe return. In these simple lines, the medieval mindset reveals itself not as cold or distant, but as deeply human, full of the same quiet hopes and fears that fill our own lives. To understand medieval love is to understand how faith and flesh coexisted uneasily, shaping every thought and act. People lived with the awareness that the body could betray the soul, yet they also knew that without love, life would feel empty. This delicate balance created a culture where affection had to be carefully expressed, often hidden behind ritual, poetry, or prayer. In the centuries that followed, these beliefs would evolve, but during the Middle Ages, they defined what it meant to love and be loved. As we move deeper into this story, keep in mind that every gesture of affection, every quiet promise, and every forbidden glance carried a weight that few of us today can fully imagine. Love was not just a feeling. It was an act of courage in a world ruled by faith, fear, and fragile hope. In the medieval world, religion was not simply a matter of belief. It was the rhythm of life itself, guiding how people thought, worked, ate, and even how they loved. From the grand cathedrals that towered over cities to the small wooden chapels in the countryside, the church shaped every part of existence. And when it came to matters of the heart and body, its influence was profound, often extending into the most private corners of life. The church taught that human desire was a gift that came with great danger. Love, in its purest form, was meant to mirror divine affection, but physical longing could easily lead one astray. Priests spoke often of sin, and they warned that indulgence could cloud the soul. The act of loving another person was to be kept within the sacred bounds of marriage, not for pleasure, but for duty, for the continuation of families and the order of society. To stray from that was to risk not just shame, but eternal punishment. Sermons described the human body as both a vessel of God's creation and a source of temptation. The writings of church fathers, such as Augustine and Jerome, told people that desire was a wound left by the fall of man, a mark of weakness that must be resisted. This teaching echoed through monasteries and markets alike. People confessed not only their deeds, but their thoughts, because even imagining temptation was considered a step toward sin. It was a world where purity was prized, and confession was a constant ritual to cleanse the heart. Despite these strict teachings, the Church's message was not entirely one of denial. Within marriage, love was seen as a virtue, as long as it served its purpose. The union of man and woman was considered a sacred bond, blessed by God, and meant to reflect the harmony between Christ and the Church. Yet even then, the language of sin lingered. To feel too much joy in love was suspect. To enjoy one's partner too freely was to risk losing sight of the spiritual purpose behind it. Medieval manuals for confessors listed countless questions to ask about personal behavior, sometimes in astonishing detail. These guides reflected the Church's deep curiosity and anxiety about how people lived their private lives. Priests were instructed to probe, to guide, and to remind their parishioners that the flesh was a battlefield. It was a time when morality was deeply intertwined with control, and every individual was taught to view themselves as both sinner and seeker of grace. Yet, within all this restraint, a more complex picture emerges. Many clergymen themselves struggled with the same desires they condemned. Monastic records speak of lapses and confessions, of monks and nuns who could not fully separate themselves from human longing. The Church, in its wisdom and hypocrisy alike, recognized that complete purity was almost impossible. So it offered confession, repentance, and forgiveness, an endless cycle that bound people to faith as tightly as to their own frailty. Religion also defined how love was expressed. Marriage ceremonies were spiritual events, performed under the eyes of God and guided by ritual. The blessing of the priest transformed a personal union into a sacred one. It was believed that divine grace sanctified the home, turning the ordinary into the holy. But outside of that ceremony, affection was often considered dangerous. A romantic gesture could be seen as vanity or worse, temptation. People were taught to hide what they felt, to filter emotion through the language of duty and devotion. For women, this influence was even stronger. The Church often portrayed women as both sacred and suspect. On one hand, they were likened to the Virgin Mary, symbols of purity and obedience. On the other, they were compared to Eve, the source of temptation and downfall. This dual image shaped how women were treated and how they were expected to behave. Their virtue was their greatest protection, and any rumor of impropriety could ruin them. Yet women also found quiet ways to resist, to express affection through gestures, letters, or the smallest acts of care. In art and literature, the Church's influence showed itself through symbolism. Angels, saints, and lovers often blended together in paintings and poetry, their boundaries blurring. The language of devotion became the language of romance. People would speak of their beloved as they might speak of God, with reverence, longing, and awe. In this way, the sacred and the personal merged, giving rise to a form of love that was both spiritual and deeply human. Even confession, that most private of acts, became a form of intimacy. The confessional was a space where the heart could speak freely, where thoughts that could not be shared elsewhere found voice. In that quiet exchange between priest and penitent, the boundaries between sin and understanding sometimes softened. It was through this practice that many came to see love not as an enemy of faith, but as a reminder of human vulnerability, the same weakness that made people seek grace in the first place. Religion did not erase desire. It shaped it. It turned it inward, wrapped it in guilt and reverence, and made it a subject of lifelong reflection. The medieval world believed that love could lead one to salvation or destruction, depending on how it was carried. To love rightly was to walk a narrow path between sin and sanctity. And while the Church built high walls to guard the soul, people continued to find small ways to climb over them, quietly, secretly, and always with the hope that love in its truest form was not something to fear but to cherish in the light of forgiveness. In the medieval world, marriage was rarely a matter of love. It was an arrangement, a transaction, a bond designed to secure land, labor, and lineage. For most people, it was as essential as it was inevitable. The Church sanctified it, families negotiated it, and society depended on it. Yet, within those practical unions, there were moments of tenderness, understanding, and sometimes, against all odds, genuine affection. Marriage in the Middle Ages was first and foremost about stability. For nobles, it meant alliances between families, strengthening claims to land or title. A young noble woman might be promised to a man she barely knew, her future decided when she was still a child. For peasants, the purpose was simpler but no less binding. Marriage meant help in the fields, hands to tend livestock, and a shared struggle to survive the seasons. It was the basic structure of life, one that bound two people not by choice, but by necessity. The Church saw marriage as a sacrament, a holy covenant blessed by God. It taught that a man and a woman were joined not merely for their own sake, but for the good of their souls and the community. Yet this spiritual ideal often collided with the harsh realities of medieval life. People married to survive, to secure inheritance, or to gain protection. Love, if it came at all, usually came later. But that did not mean it was absent. In quiet moments, in shared laughter or sorrow, many couples grew close despite the world's expectations. Marriage rituals varied across regions and centuries, but they were deeply symbolic. The exchange of vows, often spoken at the church door, made the union public. Witnesses were required, for marriage was as much a social contract as a spiritual one. Rings might be exchanged, hands joined, and blessings spoken by the priest. In some places, the couple would share a ceremonial drink or be led to their home by the community in celebration. These traditions reminded everyone that marriage was not just between two individuals, it was between two families, sometimes even two villages. For women, marriage was both security and confinement. Once wed, a woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into her husband's. Her labor, her body, even her dowry became part of the household economy. The ideal wife was obedient, pious, and industrious. Yet many women found ways to assert quiet power. They managed estates while their husbands were at war, negotiated household matters, and influenced decisions behind closed doors. In these subtle acts, they carved space for themselves in a world that rarely granted it. Among the nobility, marriage could be especially strategic. Kings and queens used it to build empires. Princes and princesses were often married off to seal peace treaties or expand influence. Their personal feelings rarely mattered. Chroniclers recorded stories of brides sent across seas to meet husbands they had never seen before. Some found friendship or kindness. Others endured cold alliances built on duty alone. Yet even in those grand halls of politics, human hearts sometimes rebelled. Affairs blossomed, forbidden letters were exchanged, and scandal followed close behind. For the lower classes, the process was simpler, but no less meaningful. A peasant couple might not have formal documents or dowries, but they still sought the church's blessing. Their vows were spoken in front of their community, and their marriage was recognized through shared life and work. In small cottages and farmhouses, love often took the form of endurance, caring for children, tending the sick, or surviving another harsh winter together. Their affection was quiet but steady, grounded in the rhythm of daily life. The church taught that marriage was indissoluble. Once vows were made, they could not easily be broken. Divorce, as we know it today, did not exist. Annulments were rare and reserved for the powerful. For most people, marriage was for life, even when it was difficult, even when it was unhappy. Adultery, especially by women, was harshly punished, while men were often judged more leniently. These double standards reflected the broader inequalities of the time, where moral expectations were divided by gender and class. Still, not all unions were cold or arranged. There are letters and poems from the medieval period that speak of love between spouses, of gratitude and longing. Some husbands wrote of missing their wives during travels. Some wives prayed daily for their husband's safe return from war. In these fragments of the past, we glimpse a gentler side of marriage, one not defined by contracts or property, but by companionship. It reminds us that even in a world ruled by duty, the human heart could still find its voice. Marriage was also a community affair. Neighbors witnessed the ceremony, celebrated the feast, and supported the couple in times of hardship. The success of one household was tied to the health of the village. In that sense, marriage was not only a private commitment, but a public promise, a thread woven into the larger fabric of society. Everyone had a role in upholding it, from priest to peasant. Yet beneath all the formality and faith, there was room for small rebellions. Lovers sometimes married in secret, eloping without family approval. Others delayed the official ceremony, living as husband and wife until the church demanded proper vows. The line between love and legality was not always clear. Over time, these human complexities forced the church to adapt, recognizing that the heart did not always follow the rules. In the end, medieval marriage was both sacred and practical, both burden and blessing. It reflected the world that created it, a world where faith dictated morality, where property defined relationships, and where love, though rare, still managed to survive. In castles and cottages alike, people sought connection, comfort, and care, even when life offered little else. For them, love was not the foundation of marriage, but its most precious reward when it finally appeared. While most medieval marriages were built on duty and survival, there was another kind of love that captured the imagination of poets, nobles, and dreamers, a love not bound by vows, but by ideals. This was courtly love, a concept that emerged in the grand halls of the nobility, far removed from the muddy fields of peasants and the quiet routines of village life. It was a fantasy, a performance, and yet it deeply influenced how generations thought about affection and longing. Courtly love began in the courts of southern France during the 12th century, where poets known as troubadours composed songs for noble patrons. These songs told of knights who adored noble ladies from afar, serving them with loyalty and passion, but rarely, if ever, possessing them. It was love as devotion, a spiritual exercise as much as an emotional one. The lady was placed on a pedestal, pure and distant, while the knight's suffering and longing became proof of his worth. To love without reward was seen as the highest virtue. This ideal was both romantic and impossible. The women celebrated in these poems were often married, and their admirers were sworn to serve them only through admiration and restraint. Theirs was a love meant to refine the soul rather than satisfy the body. The knight's longing was a symbol of nobility, the idea that love could make one brave, honorable, and pure. It was not about fulfillment, but transformation. To yearn was to grow closer to perfection. In the courts of Aquitaine and Provence, these ideas spread quickly. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the 12th century, was a great patron of this tradition. Her court became a gathering place for poets, musicians, and philosophers who celebrated the art of refined love. They developed rules and rituals for it, almost like a game. A glance could be a promise, a word could be a confession, and a secret token could mean everything. Love was treated as a noble challenge, a test of loyalty, patience, and grace. Courtly love was shaped by the tension between desire and restraint. It existed within boundaries that could never be crossed, and perhaps that was its allure. The impossibility of fulfillment made it eternal. It was a world where the heart's ache was more valuable than satisfaction, where silence and secrecy carried more weight than words. In an age ruled by the church's strict moral codes, this imagined form of love offered emotional freedom without open defiance. It gave voice to feelings that had no other place to go. The poetry of courtly love was filled with metaphors of suffering and service. A lover would compare himself to a servant, his lady to a queen, or even a divine figure. Love was portrayed as a form of worship, elevating the beloved to near holiness. The pain of longing was seen as proof of sincerity. In this way, love became both a social and spiritual art, one that demanded discipline, humility, and devotion. It was as though the rules of chivalry extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of the heart. But courtly love was not only about poetry. It shaped behavior, manners, and conversation among the nobility. Knights were expected to show courtesy, bravery, and generosity, all qualities said to arise from love. Ladies, in turn, were to inspire these virtues through grace and wisdom. In the great halls of castles, dances and feasts became stages for this delicate drama. Every gesture, every word carried meaning. Even the act of exchanging a flower could be charged with emotion. It was a language built on suggestion and restraint, where silence often spoke louder than confession. Still, behind the elegance of this idealized love lay deep contradictions. For all its talk of purity, courtly love often celebrated emotional affairs that could never be openly acknowledged. It allowed the imagination to explore what reality forbade. Many noblemen and women who participated in this tradition likely understood that it was a game, one that gave them space to feel within a society of rules. Yet the feelings it inspired were real enough, shaping art and literature for centuries to come. The influence of courtly love spread beyond France, reaching England, Italy, and Germany. Writers like Chrétien de Troyes wove its themes into the legends of King Arthur, Lancelot, and Guinevere, tales of forbidden love that blended chivalry and tragedy. Later, poets such as Dante and Petrarch would refine these ideas even further, linking earthly love with divine inspiration. The suffering lover became a symbol of the soul's yearning for something higher than itself. For women, courtly love offered a rare form of power. In this imagined world, they were the judges, the arbiters of worth, the sources of inspiration. While real women were often confined by law and custom, the women of courtly love commanded admiration and respect. Their favor could elevate a man's honor. Their rejection could humble him. It was an illusion, but one that gave voice to female dignity in a time when few other avenues existed. Of course, not everyone approved. Church authorities viewed the poetry of courtly love with suspicion, seeing in it the seeds of temptation and moral decay. Some preachers warned that this romantic worship of women was a kind of idolatry. But the songs persisted, carried from castle to castle by traveling musicians. They touched something universal, the longing for connection, for beauty, for meaning in a world often marked by hardship and restraint. Over time, courtly love evolved into something more than entertainment. It became a lens through which medieval society explored the nature of emotion itself. It reminded people that love could be noble, even when it was forbidden, and that longing could refine the spirit. It was not about escape, but elevation, an attempt to make sense of the most human of feelings in a world ruled by faith and fear. Though centuries have passed, the echoes of courtly love remain in modern ideas of romance. The gestures, the symbolism, the belief in love as a force that ennobles, all trace their roots to these medieval halls. Beneath the armor and the ceremony, courtly love was a dream, that the heart, even in a world of duty and constraint, could still imagine freedom. Away from the marble halls and poetic ideals of the nobility, love among peasants and common folk looked very different. It was less about lofty words and secret glances, and more about shared work, mutual survival, and the hope for a little comfort in a harsh world. Life for ordinary medieval people was ruled by the seasons, the harvest, and the will of their landlords. In that setting, affection was a quiet, practical thing, not sung about in verse, but felt in small acts of care that made the struggle of each day a little easier to bear. A peasant's day began early and ended late. Men worked in the fields, tending crops or livestock. Women managed the home, baked bread, spun wool, and cared for children. For many, life was a constant cycle of labor and faith. Yet even in that rhythm, there was room for laughter, companionship, and love. Young people met at markets, village festivals, or while working side by side in the fields. These were the rare moments when the burdens of duty loosened and glances could turn into something more. Marriage among commoners was rarely arranged by distant relatives or political ambition. Instead, it grew from proximity and practicality. A man might court a woman by helping her family with work or bringing small gifts, a ribbon, a carved token, or a bit of food from the hunt. Conversations happened in the fields or at the village well, brief but meaningful exchanges beneath watchful eyes. Love, for peasants, was not about romance in the modern sense, but about trust, shared effort, and endurance. The church, as always, had rules for how love should unfold. Couples were expected to seek the blessing of a priest before living together. But in practice, many poor families could not afford the full ceremony. Some simply made vows before witnesses, promising to live as husband and wife, and were later recognized by the church. These unions were sometimes called handfastings, and though not officially sanctioned at first, they were treated with respect within the community. For ordinary people, what mattered most was commitment, a shared life built through labor and loyalty. Weddings among peasants were humble but joyful. Villagers gathered to celebrate with simple food and music, and the couple's new home might be blessed with songs or prayers. There was rarely a priest in attendance for smaller communities, but the spirit of the occasion mattered more than formality. Neighbors brought gifts of grain, cheese, or ale, and the feast might last until the candles burned low. For a short while, hardship was forgotten, replaced by laughter and dance beneath the open sky. Daily life for married couples was built on cooperation. The home was a shared workshop, a space for production as much as rest. Husbands and wives depended on each other, often equally. A man alone could not manage a farm, and a woman alone would struggle to keep a household. This interdependence created a kind of respect born from necessity. Love was shown through deeds rather than words, fixing a roof together, nursing one another through illness, sharing the last of the bread in a bad year. In these gestures, affection lived quietly but deeply. For many women, marriage also offered protection. Though their freedoms were limited, being part of a household gave them stability in a world that offered little safety to the unmarried. Widows often remarried quickly, both for security and for the continuation of the household. In this way, love was intertwined with survival. The emotional side of marriage was not ignored, but it was understood as something that developed through shared struggle, not as something that began with passion. Young love, however, still found its way into the villages. Festivals, harvest dances, and religious holidays gave young people time to mingle. Music, drink, and community celebration often led to flirtation. Many songs from the period, passed down orally through generations, speak of these moments, describing young men trying to win the favor of girls through humor, persistence, or song. Some of these courtships led to lifelong bonds. Others were fleeting, remembered only in whispers or ballads. The boundaries between love and sin were not always clear in rural life. The church preached chastity before marriage, but reality often told another story. Records from local courts show many cases of couples who began life together before formal vows were exchanged. Some were later married properly. Others faced small fines or public penance. It was less about moral outrage and more about social order. The community wanted stability, not scandal, and if a couple seemed committed, they were usually forgiven. There were also darker sides to peasant relationships. Poverty, hunger, and the pressures of labor could strain families. Women often bore many children, and childbirth carried great risk. Illness and death were constant companions, and grief was a shared language in every home. Yet even through tragedy, people sought comfort in one another. Love in this world was not fragile. It was resilient, built to withstand loss and hardship. It did not burn brightly, but it endured quietly, like an ember that never went out. Despite the simplicity of their lives, common folk had their own wisdom about love. They knew it could not be forced, that affection needed time and patience. Folk songs, proverbs, and tales passed down through generations reflected this understanding. They warned against greed in choosing a partner, praised kindness over beauty, and valued faithfulness above passion. To love, in their eyes, was to work together and to forgive. It is easy to imagine the Middle Ages as a time without tenderness, but that would be wrong. In the dim glow of a cottage hearth, a husband mending a tool while his wife spun wool beside him, there was a quiet intimacy that no poetry could capture. It was not grand or adorned with ritual, but it was real. In those moments, surrounded by the sounds of the night and the simple comfort of companionship, love existed in its most human form, not idealized, not forbidden, but lived. And that, perhaps, is what made it strongest of all. Before love could become marriage, it had to begin with the delicate dance of courtship, a process shaped by custom, class, and quiet courage. In the medieval world, the art of wooing looked different depending on who you were. For nobles, it was wrapped in poetry and ceremony. For peasants, it was simpler, grounded in gestures and honest work. But for everyone, the act of winning someone's affection was both exciting and uncertain, governed by rules spoken and unspoken, and by the ever-present gaze of family, faith, and community. Among the nobility, courtship was almost theatrical. Men were expected to prove their devotion through words, gifts, and restraint. A knight might compose a poem or dedicate a song to a lady of higher rank, declaring admiration that he could never hope to fulfill. This was part of the ideal of courtly love, a noble passion purified by distance and self-control. In the courts of France and England, lovers exchanged coded glances and letters sealed with wax, each one filled with flowery language and metaphor. To confess love directly was rare. The thrill lay in suggestion and subtlety. For the wealthy, gifts played an important role. A silk ribbon, a carved brooch, or even a lock of hair could become a token of affection. Each item carried meaning, understood only by the two who shared it. To receive a gift was to acknowledge the feeling, even if nothing more could come of it. In some courts, these exchanges were almost ceremonial, with witnesses present and decorum maintained. A lady's acceptance of a favor from a knight might be enough to inspire him for a lifetime. These rituals turned emotion into art, transforming love into something noble, distant, and dignified. For ordinary people, courtship was less formal, but no less meaningful. In villages and towns, it often began at festivals or holy days, when work paused and people gathered to celebrate. Dances were common, and they provided one of the few opportunities for young men and women to meet freely. Music filled the air, ale flowed, and laughter softened the edges of social restraint. In these moments, a smile, a shared drink, or a hand briefly touched could spark the beginnings of something lasting. The simplest gesture, offering a flower, helping to carry a basket, could be a way of saying, "I see you, I care." In many communities, words were less important than actions. A man might prove his intentions by helping with farm work or repairing a fence for the woman's family. A woman might return his kindness with a loaf of bread, a handmade token, or by including him in family gatherings. These were not grand gestures, but they carried weight. They were the quiet negotiations of daily life that signaled trust and interest. Love was built slowly, through shared effort and mutual respect. The Church, always attentive to human behavior, tried to regulate these customs. Priests warned against excessive flirtation and reminded their congregations that courtship should lead to marriage, not temptation. Still, many communities had long-standing traditions that mixed innocence and mischief. One such custom was the charivari, a playful public event in which young villagers teased couples thought to be courting. Though it could be embarrassing, it was also a way for the community to acknowledge a budding romance. In its own way, it was a blessing, noisy, rough, and full of laughter. Courtship also had its regional variations. In parts of Germany and Scandinavia, winter evenings were occasions for bundling, when young men and women were allowed to sit together under blankets, often fully clothed, to talk and get to know one another. It was a practice both chaperoned and accepted, meant to balance curiosity with propriety. In other places, love tokens were exchanged secretly, small charms or carved symbols left at doorsteps or hidden in clothing. These private exchanges carried a thrill of secrecy that made them all the more precious. For nobles, Love letters became an art form of their own. Written in flowing Latin or the emerging languages of Europe, these letters often blended passion and piety. They spoke of loyalty, longing, and eternal devotion, comparing love to light, to music, or to divine grace. For those who could not write, messengers carried their words, memorized or whispered in secrecy. These letters, preserved in some medieval collections, reveal a depth of feeling that cuts across centuries. They speak of hope, fear, and joy, emotions that remain as familiar now as they were then. Music, too, played a role in wooing. Troubadours and minstrels composed songs that praised the virtues of love, and sometimes these melodies were used to convey private messages. A knight might request a particular tune at a feast, knowing the lady he admired would understand its meaning. Among common folk, simpler songs were sung during work or at gatherings, their verses filled with playful teasing or declarations of affection. Through these songs, love became a shared language of the people. Of course, not all wooing ended happily. Some affections were unreturned, others forbidden. Social class could stand as an unmovable wall between two hearts. A peasant could not hope to marry into nobility, and even within the same village, family expectations could intervene. There were stories of heartbreak, of promises made and broken, of young people separated by parents or priests. Medieval ballads often told such tales, not to discourage love, but to remind listeners of its risks and its power. For those who did find love returned, the path to marriage was still filled with rituals. Families would meet to discuss dowries, property, and inheritance. Public announcements were made in church, giving anyone with objections the chance to speak. But before all that came the quiet, fragile beginning, the first meeting, the nervous smile, the small gift passed from hand to hand. In that moment, no matter the century, love was the same, uncertain, hopeful, and full of possibility. In the medieval world, to woo was not merely to persuade, but to prove oneself. It was an act of patience and persistence, shaped by custom, but driven by feeling. Whether in a grand hall or a humble village square, it was a reminder that beneath all the rules of faith and class, people still reached out for connection. They still longed to be seen, to be chosen, to be loved. And in those fleeting moments of courage, a song sung, a token given, a promise whispered, the human heart revealed itself, timeless and unchanged. In the medieval world, love and relationships were deeply shaped by power, not just the power of kings and nobles, but the quiet, everyday power between men and women. From the highest court to the smallest village, everyone knew their place in a carefully structured society. Gender defined what one could do, how one could speak, and even how one could love. Men were expected to lead and protect, while women were told to obey and serve. Yet, behind these strict expectations, real people often bent the rules, finding small ways to assert their will in a world that gave them little room to do so. For men, the ideal was strength, courage, and control. A man was judged by how well he could provide for his household, defend his honor, and uphold his word. Knights were the highest example of this ideal, brave, loyal, and disciplined, serving both their lords and the women they admired. Among commoners, the same virtues were echoed in simpler ways. A good husband worked hard, treated his family fairly, and maintained his household with pride. To fail in these duties was to lose respect, not just in the eyes of others, but in his own sense of self. For women, expectations were far narrower. From birth, they were taught obedience, modesty, and piety. Their worth was tied to their reputation, and that reputation could be lost with a single rumor. A woman's role was to nurture, to raise children, manage the home, and support her husband. Her life was shaped by the men around her, her father before marriage, her husband afterward. Yet, within these limitations, women found ways to exercise quiet power. They managed finances, arranged alliances, and made household decisions that affected the survival of entire families. Many chroniclers of the time underestimated how much influence women truly held. The church reinforced these divisions with its teachings. Priests preached that man was the head and woman the heart, that both were necessary, but not equal. Sermons compared marriage to the harmony between body and soul, with men guiding and women supporting. The story of Adam and Eve was often cited as justification. Woman was created from man, and her weakness had brought about the fall. This idea echoed through every level of society, shaping how people thought about gender and morality for centuries. Yet despite these teachings, women were not powerless. Noble women, especially, could wield significant influence. When their husbands were away at war or court, they managed estates, oversaw tenants, and sometimes even defended castles. Their education, though limited, often included reading, writing, and accounting, skills that made them indispensable. Some women became renowned for their wisdom and diplomacy, advising rulers and even shaping policies behind the scenes. Queens like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Blanche of Castile were powerful figures in their own right, using charm and intellect to command respect in male-dominated worlds. Among the lower classes, women's work was essential to survival. They labored in fields, brewed ale, wove cloth, and sold goods at markets. In many cases, they worked side by side with their husbands, sharing both burdens and decisions. Though the law gave men authority, practical life demanded cooperation. A successful household depended on partnership, and while men held the title of head of house, women were often its heart and hands. Still, there was danger in stepping outside expectations. A woman who spoke too boldly or lived too freely could be condemned as immoral. Tales of unruly wives or wayward women filled moral texts, warning others to stay within their bounds. The fear of female independence ran deep, rooted in both religion and superstition. Women were sometimes accused of witchcraft simply for being different, for living alone, for practicing herbal medicine, or for defying social norms. Such accusations served as a reminder to others. Power, when held by women, was seen as a threat to order. Even love reflected this imbalance. Men were praised for their passion, women judged for theirs. A man's desire was seen as natural. A woman's was seen as temptation. This double standard shaped everything from laws to literature. In romances, women were often portrayed as distant objects of adoration, inspiring men to noble deeds, but rarely acting on their own will. Yet in reality, women's choices, however limited, mattered deeply. They chose partners, managed families, and often bore the emotional labor of maintaining peace in their homes. There were, of course, moments when these roles blurred. Some women entered convents, rejecting marriage entirely in favor of faith. Within monasteries, they found education, community, and a kind of autonomy rare in the outside world. Abbesses ruled over lands and nuns, wielding both spiritual and administrative power. Though the church restricted them in theory, in practice they built spaces of learning and influence that challenged the very hierarchy that tried to contain them. Men, too, were bound by their roles. The same expectations that gave them authority also demanded endless responsibility. A poor harvest, a lost battle, or a failed business could destroy a man's honor. Those who could not provide were often judged harshly. For many, love became a refuge, one of the few places where they could show tenderness without shame. Letters and poems from the time show men speaking of their feelings with surprising vulnerability, expressing longing and devotion that went beyond social expectation. Power in medieval relationships was rarely balanced, but it was constantly negotiated. Every marriage, every bond between man and woman, existed within this tension between duty and desire, authority and affection. While the system favored men, it was not without cracks. Behind every public face of obedience, there were private acts of strength and defiance. A wife managing the family's affairs, a widow keeping her property, a nun writing poetry. These were quiet rebellions against a world that insisted on defining them. In the end, gender and power shaped how medieval people understood love. It was not simply an emotion, but a structure, one that reflected their beliefs about the world itself. Yet within that structure, people found ways to be human. They laughed, argued, comforted, and cared for one another. And though the rules were strict, the heart remained unpredictable. It found freedom in small gestures, in whispered words, in the fragile moments where power gave way to understanding. Love, even in the shadow of hierarchy, remained a force that could not be completely controlled. Not all love in the medieval world followed the rules. Beneath the surface of faith, family, and duty, there existed another kind of passion, quiet, dangerous, and often hidden. It was the love that defied vows and social order. It flourished in whispers and secrecy. In a time when honor meant everything and reputation could be destroyed in an instant, these forbidden connections carried both danger and allure. Yet they persisted, because even in a world of rules and punishment, the human heart refused to be governed entirely by fear. For the noble classes, forbidden love often unfolded within the complex world of courtly life. Marriages among the elite were arranged for politics, not affection. Husbands and wives might share estates and titles, but not intimacy. In that emotional emptiness, some turned to secret companionships. A lady might fall for her husband's squire, or a knight might be drawn to a married noblewoman whose kindness stood out amid the cold formalities of the court. These affairs were rarely spoken of openly, but they lingered in glances across the hall, in the careful passing of notes, in moments that could mean everything and nothing at all. The poetry of the time captured this hidden world. Troubadours sang of love that could not be named, of women trapped in marriages they did not choose, and men who risked everything for a single touch or word. The language was symbolic, but everyone understood its meaning. To speak too plainly would invite scandal. To speak too little would make the longing unbearable. The songs gave voice to what could not be lived, love that existed only in the imagination, bound by secrecy and pain. Among common people, forbidden love took different forms. It might be a widow and a priest, or two young people who could not afford to marry. It might be a servant and the master's daughter, or a woman promised to one man, but in love with another. These stories rarely ended in joy. The church and the community guarded morality closely, and transgressions could bring harsh punishment. Public shame, exile, or even physical penalties awaited those who were caught. Yet for all that, the heart continued to wander, and love continued to find its way where it was least expected. One of the most dangerous forms of forbidden love was between clergy and lay people. Priests, monks, and nuns had taken vows of celibacy, dedicating their lives entirely to God, but not all could keep those promises. In some cases, priests lived quietly with women, their unions tolerated by their parishioners, but condemned by the church. Letters and confessions from the period show that even holy men struggled with human longing. The monastery walls were meant to contain desire, but they often became places where that desire deepened through isolation and reflection. For women, the risk of forbidden love was far greater. A married woman discovered in an affair could lose everything: her status, her home, even her life. The law was rarely kind to her. Men, by contrast, might face little more than gossip or a fine. This imbalance reflected the broader injustice of the time, where women bore the full weight of moral expectation. Yet despite the danger, some women chose love over safety, driven by longing too strong to silence. In letters and poems, their voices still echo, filled with fear, hope, and the stubborn will to feel alive. In cities and towns, secrecy was a fragile thing. Neighbors watched closely, and gossip spread quickly. Even a single visit too many, a look held too long, could spark suspicion. Some lovers met in churches after dark, others in barns, gardens, or the edges of forests. These meetings were fleeting, shadowed by the knowledge that discovery could mean ruin. Yet the risk seemed to make the feeling stronger. In a world where so much was controlled by law, by faith, by birth, the act of choosing love freely, even for a moment, felt like rebellion. Literature and legend from the time are filled with stories of forbidden love. The tale of Tristan and Isolde, perhaps the most famous of all, told of two people bound by fate and desire, caught between loyalty and passion. Their story, like so many others, ends in tragedy, not because love was wrong, but because the world around them would not allow it to exist. These tales resonated deeply with medieval audiences. They were reminders that love could be both beautiful and destructive, that it could elevate the soul even as it broke it. The Church condemned adultery as a mortal sin, but the confessional offered a kind of mercy. Many who strayed sought forgiveness, weeping and praying to be absolved. Some priests counseled repentance. Others, quietly sympathetic, understood that the line between sin and human weakness was not always clear. The cycle of temptation, guilt, and confession became part of the rhythm of medieval life, binding the sacred and the sinful in an uneasy harmony. There were also more tender stories of lovers who waited, who endured separation for years, who found one another again despite the odds. Some couples began as secret lovers and later married when fortune or circumstance allowed it. Their stories remind us that forbidden love was not always about scandal. Sometimes it was simply about two souls trying to find a place for their feelings in a world that left little room for them. The deeper truth is that forbidden love in the Middle Ages was not so different from today. It was born from the same longing for connection, the same desire to be seen and understood. It thrived on secrecy because secrecy gave it intensity. Every look, every word, carried the weight of danger and devotion. In the stillness of the night, in hidden corners of castles or quiet village lanes, lovers whispered promises they knew might never be kept. And yet, they whispered them anyway. In those moments, love became something sacred in its own right, not because it was blessed by the Church or approved by society, but because it existed at all. To love in defiance of the rules was to claim a small piece of freedom in a world that offered very little. It was fragile, fleeting, and often tragic, but it was also undeniably human. In the shadows of the medieval world, where silence and secrecy reigned, love found a way to speak, softly, courageously, and always against the odds. To understand how people in the Middle Ages viewed love and desire, we must step into the world of medieval medicine, a world that mixed science, superstition, and philosophy in equal measure. Long before biology or psychology existed as we know them, physicians and scholars believed that every emotion and impulse was shaped by the balance of the body's internal forces. Love, passion, and attraction were not seen merely as feelings, but as physical conditions, sometimes virtuous, sometimes dangerous, and often mysterious. The foundation of medieval medicine came from the ancient world, especially the teachings of the Greek physician Galen and the philosopher Aristotle. Their ideas were preserved and expanded by Arab and European scholars, forming the medical doctrine known as the Four Humors. According to this belief, the human body was governed by four fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each was associated with an element, a season, and a temperament. Health came from balance. Illness came from imbalance. And love, in this framework, was often described as a fever of the blood, a kind of temporary madness caused by heat rising within the body. If someone suffered from lovesickness, physicians truly believed they were ill. Their skin might grow pale, their appetite fade, and their thoughts drift endlessly toward the person who had captured their heart. The pulse quickened, sleep became restless, and melancholy set in. Medical texts described these symptoms in detail and even offered cures. The remedies were often as curious as the diagnosis. A change of scenery, a bath infused with calming herbs, or a long sermon to redirect the soul. Sometimes, patients were told to confess their feelings to a priest, or, if possible, to fulfill their desire so that balance might be restored. The line between medicine and morality was thin. Doctors, priests, and philosophers often spoke in the same language when discussing love. Passion was both a physical condition and a moral struggle. Too much heat in the blood led to lust. Too little made one cold or indifferent. This connection between body and virtue meant that health was not just a matter of flesh, but of faith. The body reflected the soul's condition, and the soul, in turn, influenced the body's harmony. In monasteries, scholars copied and commented on medical treatises that blended observation with theology. One text might describe the workings of the heart and brain, while another explained how desire could cloud judgment and endanger salvation. Even in their attempts to understand love, medieval thinkers could not separate it from sin and sanctity. The heart was not merely an organ, but a symbol of divine and human struggle. Some physicians believed that attraction was guided by natural forces, invisible influences that drew people together. They described the eyes as channels through which love entered the body. To look upon someone too long could ignite a spark that traveled to the heart, stirring the humors and upsetting the mind. This idea, called the doctrine of the gaze, was taken seriously. It explained not only love at first sight, but also the mysterious illnesses that seemed to follow unfulfilled longing. The cure, according to some, was avoidance. Others suggested prayer or fasting to cool the heated spirit. There were also gendered theories about how love affected men and women differently. Men were thought to be hotter and drier by nature, women colder and wetter. This made men more prone to sudden passions, while women were believed to experience emotion more deeply but less explosively. Physicians claimed that a woman's health could be harmed by excessive longing or by remaining unmarried, arguing that affection, even desire, had physical consequences. While such ideas reflected misunderstanding, they reveal how deeply the body and the heart were intertwined in medieval thought. Midwives and herbal healers, working outside the formal structures of medicine, often had their own remedies for matters of love. They used herbs like valerian, mint, and lavender to calm troubled hearts, or potions made from honey, spices, and wine to awaken warmth where it had faded. Some of these remedies were practical. Others were half magic, half medicine. In their quiet way, these women carried on traditions of care that blended empathy with folk wisdom, seeing love not as sin or sickness, but as a natural part of being alive. Astrology, too, played a role in understanding passion. Physicians often consulted the stars before prescribing treatment. Each planet was said to govern certain aspects of the body and soul. Venus ruled love and beauty, Mars ruled desire and courage, and the moon influenced emotion and fertility. The alignment of these celestial bodies could, in theory, explain why someone fell in love or fell ill. A physician might advise a patient to wait for a favorable phase of Venus before declaring affection, believing that even the heavens had to be aligned for love to flourish. The Church tolerated these medical ideas as long as they did not contradict faith. Love could be studied as long as it was not celebrated too freely. Still, the tension between body and soul remained. For every physician who treated lovesickness as a physical ailment, there was a preacher who called it a test of virtue. The result was a culture where emotion itself was medicalized, where to love too much was to be unwell, and to love too little was to be cold of spirit. Beneath all the theories and treatises, there was a quiet acknowledgement that love could not be fully explained. It was both natural and divine, a bridge between the earthly and the spiritual. Even the most learned doctors admitted that no remedy could truly cure the heart. The best they could offer was comfort, a belief that understanding the body might somehow ease the mind. In the dim chambers of medieval scholars, surrounded by scrolls and ink, the study of love was both scientific and sacred. They charted its symptoms, debated its origins, and sought to master it through logic. But in the end, they returned to the same truth that poets and peasants already knew. Love was not a disease to be cured. It was a condition to be lived with, unpredictable, consuming, and as essential to the human spirit as breath itself. Beauty in the medieval world was not only about how someone looked, but what their appearance said about their soul, their station, and their character. In a time before mirrors were common and perfumes were rare, attraction was often shaped by the ideals of modesty, health, and social order. To be beautiful was to seem balanced in body, in dress, and in virtue. Yet across all levels of society, from noble courts to quiet villages, people still found ways to make themselves more appealing, guided by both faith and fashion. For the nobility, clothing was the clearest expression of beauty and status. Sumptuous fabrics like velvet, silk, and fine linen were reserved for the wealthy. Colors held meaning. Deep reds and blues were symbols of power, while white suggested purity. Gold thread, embroidery, and jewels adorned the garments of both men and women, turning everyday attire into a display of wealth and refinement. Men wore tunics that fit close to the body, with long sleeves and finely tailored hoods. Women wore gowns that flowed to the floor, their sleeves trailing elegantly, often layered with veils and wimples that covered the hair and neck. Hair, in particular, carried powerful meaning. For women, long, shining hair was seen as a mark of beauty and fertility, but also of temptation. Married women were expected to cover their hair in public, as a sign of modesty and obedience. Unmarried girls, however, often let their hair fall freely at festivals or during dances, a quiet signal of youth and availability. Men, too, paid attention to their hair and beards. Knights often kept them neatly trimmed, while scholars and monks shaved their heads in tonsure, a symbol of humility before God. In villages, clothing was simpler, but no less expressive. Peasants wore garments made of wool or linen, dyed with natural colors like brown, green, and gray. Even without fine materials, people found ways to show care in their appearance. A clean tunic, a fresh kerchief, or a bit of ribbon could speak of pride and self-respect. At fairs and holy days, many would wear their best clothes, repaired and washed, hoping to catch the eye of someone special. Beauty for them was less about luxury and more about vitality. The glow of health, the strength of hands accustomed to work, the brightness of eyes that met yours without fear. Hygiene in the Middle Ages has often been misunderstood. While it is true that daily bathing was rare, people were far from indifferent to cleanliness. Most washed their hands and faces regularly, and many towns had public bathhouses where both men and women could bathe, though usually at separate times. In some regions, bathing became a social event, a place to relax, talk, and even flirt. The scent of herbs like rosemary and mint often filled the air, and oils were used to soften the skin. Water, in its simplest form, was both cleansing and symbolic, tied to religious purity and renewal. Perfumes and cosmetics were another subtle way of enhancing attraction. Wealthy women sometimes used rosewater, lavender, or musk oils, imported from distant lands. Men might rub their hands or hair with scented oils before feasts or ceremonies. Cosmetics were controversial. While some powders and creams were made from harmless herbs or chalk, others used dangerous ingredients like lead or mercury. The church disapproved of excessive adornment, teaching that true beauty came from within. But even so, the quiet art of self-presentation persisted. People wanted to be seen, admired, and remembered, no matter what sermon said. Medieval ideas of beauty were deeply tied to balance and harmony, both physical and moral. A symmetrical face, clear skin, and bright eyes were signs of health and virtue. Illness, scars, or deformities were often unfairly viewed as signs of spiritual flaw. Fair skin was highly prized among the wealthy, not only because it was associated with purity, but because it showed a life free from labor in the sun. Among the working classes, though, sun-browned skin was common and accepted, admired as a sign of strength and vitality. Beauty, like everything else, was filtered through class and circumstance. For both men and women, posture and behavior were also part of attraction. Grace, humility, and courtesy mattered as much as looks. A person who spoke gently and moved with care was considered beautiful in spirit, regardless of appearance. The concept of comeliness in medieval thought included kindness, generosity, and dignity. To be well-mannered was to be desirable. Love manuals of the time, small books written for the nobility, often advised readers on how to speak sweetly, walk properly, and smile without arrogance. Even in an age of strict morality, charm was seen as a virtue. Art and literature shaped ideals. To the medieval mind, the universe was alive with meaning. The stars above were not distant or cold. They were signs, messages written across the heavens by divine design. Every event on earth, from harvests to wars to the stirrings of the heart, was believed to be influenced by the movements of the planets. Love, perhaps the most mysterious force of all, was thought to follow the same celestial patterns. And where knowledge ended, magic began, filling the spaces that faith and science could not yet explain. Astrology in the Middle Ages was not seen as superstition, but as a serious study. Learned men charted the heavens to predict everything from weather to destiny. Physicians consulted birth charts to understand a person's temperament, and kings relied on astrologers before making decisions. Within this framework, love was viewed as part of a cosmic order. The attraction between two people mirrored the attraction between celestial bodies. When Venus, the planet of affection, aligned favorably with Mars, the planet of desire, it was said that passion would flourish. When Saturn's shadow crossed those same stars, love might be doomed to sorrow. Astrologers believed that each person was born under the influence of a particular constellation, shaping their nature and their fate in love. A man born under Leo, ruled by the sun, was said to be proud and bold in romance, while one under Pisces might be tender and dreamy. Women born under Libra were thought to possess balance and charm. Those under Scorpio, mystery and strength. Compatibility between signs was debated with the same seriousness that theologians reserve for Scripture. It was not uncommon for nobles to seek an astrologer's advice before arranging a marriage, hoping to ensure harmony or to justify a match already made. For ordinary people, the stars were less a study and more a comfort. They looked up at the night sky and saw stories written there, lovers separated by fate, eternal chases between constellations, and signs of divine approval or warning. Folk wisdom blended astrology with everyday life. If a couple met beneath a waxing moon, it was said their love would grow. If beneath a waning one, it might fade. Shooting stars were omens of passion, comets signs of change. In a world without modern explanations, the heavens offered both mystery and meaning. Alongside astrology, love was also surrounded by the quiet persistence of magic. Amulets, charms, and potions circulated through villages and courts alike, often passed down through generations. Some were made by cunning folk, healers, wise women, or wandering herbalists who mixed natural knowledge with superstition. They might sell a charm to attract affection, a powder to cool desire, or a potion to heal a broken heart. These practices lived in the shadow of the church, which condemned them as sorcery, but could never quite erase them. For many, magic was simply another form of hope. One common charm was a love knot, made by twisting threads together while reciting a prayer or spell. The knot represented the binding of two hearts, and was often hidden in clothing or placed beneath a pillow. Herbs such as rosemary, vervain, and basil were thought to draw love's favor. Rose petals steeped in wine might be drunk by two people to strengthen affection. Honey was used in spells for sweetness and harmony, while salt protected against jealousy and deceit. These rituals were rarely dramatic, more often quiet gestures of belief, part prayer and part wish. Astrological timing also played a role in magical practices. Certain days were considered more powerful for declaring love or beginning courtship. Fridays, sacred to Venus, were favored for proposals or wedding vows. The hours of dawn and twilight were thought to hold special potency, as the boundary between light and dark symbolized transformation. Even the placement of candles, or the direction of a house as doorway, could be interpreted for romantic success. To modern eyes, these details seem fanciful, but for medieval people, they offered a sense of control over life's most unpredictable emotion. Dreams were another space where astrology and magic met. Dream interpretation manuals, popular among both scholars and common folk, explained how visions of certain stars, animals, or people foretold romantic fortune. Dreaming of a rose meant affection was near. Dreaming of fire warned of passion that could consume. These guides were often copied by hand and shared quietly, as they blurred the line between faith and forbidden knowledge. To dream was to receive messages from beyond, from heaven, fate, or the heart itself. The Church, wary of such practices, often spoke against astrology and love magic. Clergymen warned that turning to the stars was a form of pride, an attempt to know what only God should decide. Yet even some within the Church were fascinated by these ideas. Monks studied planetary movements as part of their scholarly work, and cathedral builders aligned their structures with celestial events. The more the heavens were studied, the harder it became to separate faith from fascination. Many saw no contradiction in believing that God had written his will into the stars for humanity to read. For those who felt love's uncertainty, the ache of waiting, the fear of rejection, the pain of distance, astrology and magic offered comfort. They gave shape to the invisible, turning emotion into something that could be touched, measured, or influenced. A woman lighting a candle for her beloved beneath the full moon. A man carrying a sprig of rosemary for luck. These were small acts of faith, born from the same longing that drives people even now to look for signs in the world around them. In truth, astrology and magic reflected humanity's oldest desire, to understand love's mystery. People wanted to believe that the universe cared about their hearts, that fate was not random, and that even the stars could sympathize with longing. Whether written in constellations or whispered in secret, these beliefs gave meaning to the chaos of feeling. They made love seem not like chance, but destiny, a thread woven through the fabric of the cosmos itself. In the flicker of a candle, under a night sky unspoiled by light, a medieval lover might have looked upward and wondered if the stars looked back. Perhaps they did. For in those moments, belief and beauty became one, a quiet reminder that love, like the heavens, has always been both mysterious and infinite. In the Middle Ages, few lives were as disciplined and demanding as those of the men and women who devoted themselves to the Church. Monks, nuns, and priests were expected to rise above worldly temptation, to renounce family, marriage, and desire, and to dedicate their entire existence to God. Celibacy was not merely a rule. It was a vow, a sacred commitment to purity and service. Yet behind monastery walls, and within the quiet corridors of convents, the story was far more complex, one of faith, struggle, and the inescapable pull of human emotion. The Church taught that celibacy freed the soul from distraction. By abstaining from physical pleasure, one could turn all energy toward prayer, study, and the contemplation of divine mysteries. The body was seen as a vessel of temptation, and desire as a burden that clouded spiritual clarity. For many who entered religious life, this ideal was deeply appealing. The world outside was full of chaos and sin, while within the cloister there was structure, order, and the promise of closeness to God. To take vows was to step away from the noise of the world and seek peace and silence. For monks, daily life was governed by ritual. They woke before dawn to chant prayers, worked in the fields or the scriptorium, and gathered again for worship throughout the day. Every hour was accounted for, every act a form of devotion. Yet even within this life of discipline, the mind and body could wander. Medieval writings reveal that temptation was a constant struggle. Monks confessed to dreams they could not control, to fleeting thoughts that broke through their resolve. They prayed for strength, fasted to quiet the flesh, and sought forgiveness in endless cycles of guilt and grace. Nuns faced similar challenges, but within their own unique world. Convents were often both places of refuge and confinement. For some women, joining a convent was a calling. For others, it was chosen by their families, especially among the nobility, where younger daughters were often dedicated to the church to preserve wealth and inheritance. Inside those walls, women found community, education, and sometimes a measure of freedom unknown to those bound by marriage. They managed estates, tended gardens, wrote letters, and copied manuscripts. Their lives were filled with prayer, work, and song. But they, too, were human, and in their writings one finds traces of longing for companionship, for touch, for the world beyond the cloister gate. Letters written by medieval nuns sometimes express deep affection for their spiritual mentors or fellow sisters, in language that blurs the line between devotion and love. These words were rarely condemned, for they were seen as expressions of divine affection. Yet the emotions behind them were undeniably human. Friendship in such settings could become intense, even passionate, as shared faith and closeness created bonds unlike any others. These connections gave warmth to lives otherwise ruled by restraint. Among the clergy, the demand for celibacy was equally strict, but in practice, it was not always kept. Parish priests, especially in rural areas, often lived quietly with women or had children despite church law. Some communities turned a blind eye, seeing it as natural that men of faith might seek companionship. The higher church authorities, however, saw it differently. Councils were held, edicts issued, and confessions demanded, yet the pattern continued. The struggle between ideal and reality was ongoing, a reminder that even sacred vows could not entirely silence the needs of the heart. For those who did keep their vows, celibacy became a form of spiritual discipline. It was a daily battle, fought through prayer, fasting, and meditation. Some monks and nuns wrote of channeling their emotions into love for God, transforming desire into devotion. This was known as spiritual marriage, a union not of the body, but of the soul. Mystics such as Hildegard of Bingen and Bernard of Clairvaux wrote of this state with passion and imagery so vivid that it blurred the boundary between divine and human love. Their words reveal how intertwined the two could be, how the longing for God echoed the same yearning that defined all forms of affection. Yet there were also darker sides to this ideal. Some monasteries became places of repression, where guilt and punishment replaced peace. The human body, treated as an enemy, was sometimes subjected to harsh penance. Monks wore rough garments that scratched the skin or slept on bare floors to deny themselves comfort. Fasting until weakness set in was seen as a victory over temptation. But such practices, while born of devotion, also reveal the deep fear of desire that haunted the medieval soul, the belief that holiness could only be achieved through struggle and denial. Convents, too, were not always tranquil. There were rivalries, loneliness, and sometimes despair. Some nuns entered religious life unwillingly, sent there as children, and spent their days dreaming of the lives they might have lived outside the walls. Others found joy in their vocation, turning the cloister into a place of creativity and purpose. They composed hymns, wrote poetry, and cared for the sick. Within the quiet of their chapels, love took on many forms. Friendship, compassion, and the yearning for divine connection that mirrored the deepest human needs. Outside these walls, the world often viewed celibacy with both reverence and suspicion. Ordinary people respected monks and nuns for their holiness, but they also whispered about what might happen in hidden corridors and behind closed doors. Stories circulated of secret liaisons and fallen clerics, of forbidden love discovered and punished. Whether true or not, such tales spoke to the fascination and unease that surrounded those who lived apart from the ordinary rhythms of life. To renounce love entirely was both admirable and unnatural, and medieval society never stopped wondering what truly happened in those quiet places of prayer. Despite the rules, the lives of monks, nuns, and clergy were as full of feeling as any others. Their hearts beat with the same hopes and fears, the same need for connection and understanding. Some failed their vows and found forgiveness. Others kept them and found peace. Many walked the line between both, imperfect, devoted, and profoundly human. Celibacy, in the end, was not simply the absence of love, but a different way of experiencing it. For those who lived it honestly, it became a form of devotion so deep that it resembled passion itself, a love without possession, a longing without end. And for those who stumbled, their failures remind us that the human spirit, even when it seeks the divine, cannot easily escape its own nature. In every cloister, in every cell, the story was the same. To be human was to desire, and to desire was to seek something beyond oneself, whether in another's arms or in the arms of God. In the medieval world, where faith shaped every corner of life and morality was a public concern, few subjects were as complex and contradictory as prostitution. It existed everywhere, in great cities, small towns, and even near monasteries, yet it was both condemned and tolerated. The church, the law, and society could not fully agree on how to treat it. On one hand, it was seen as sinful and shameful. On the other, it was considered a necessary evil, a way to protect respectable women from unwanted attention and to maintain social order. In this uneasy balance, thousands of women lived their lives on the edges of society, caught between survival and judgment. The church's view of prostitution was deeply conflicted. Officially, it condemned the selling of the body as a grave sin. Priests warned that those who practiced it endangered their souls and the souls of those who paid them. Yet the same church also argued that without such outlets, men might be driven to worse sins, adultery, violence, or assaults on the innocent. Thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas described prostitution as a kind of moral sewer, foul, but necessary to keep the rest of society clean. It was a troubling logic, one that revealed the contradictions of a world where ideals of purity met the realities of human desire. Cities across medieval Europe developed their own laws and customs around the trade. Many allowed brothels to operate under strict control, often near the edges of towns or along riverbanks. These establishments were taxed, supervised, and sometimes even protected by local authorities. In some cases, the earnings helped fund public works or charity. It was a form of practical hypocrisy, the acknowledgement that what was forbidden could also be profitable. For the women who worked there, it was often the only path left open to them in a society that offered few choices. Most women who entered the trade did not do so willingly. Poverty, abandonment, and widowhood were the most common reasons. Without property or family support, a woman had little means to survive. Some were orphans or runaways seeking freedom from abusive homes. Others were former servants who had been seduced or dismissed when they became pregnant. Once labeled as fallen, it was nearly impossible to return to respectability. The stigma followed them for life, and yet, within the walls of brothels and taverns, they found a kind of community fragile but real. Conditions in such places varied widely. In larger towns like Paris, London, or Venice, some brothels were relatively regulated and offered protection to their workers. In poorer areas, life was far harsher. Women faced violence, disease, and exploitation. Many were subject to fines, imprisonment, or public humiliation if caught outside the designated districts. Some cities forced them to wear distinctive clothing, yellow veils, striped cloaks, or specific badges, marking them as different from honest women. It was a cruel reminder that even in a tolerated profession, they were never truly accepted. Despite this, brothels were often woven quietly into the life of the city. Sailors, soldiers, and laborers frequented them openly. Festivals and pilgrimages drew visitors who filled both churches and taverns. Moral reformers condemned the behavior, but many townsfolk simply accepted it as part of life. Some landlords and city officials even profited from the trade, collecting rent and taxes. This uneasy coexistence reflected the broader contradictions of the time, a society that preached chastity but lived amid temptation. The church tried repeatedly to impose reform. Councils and bishops issued decrees demanding the closure of brothels, yet these efforts rarely lasted. The economic and social needs that sustained them were too strong. Instead, the church focused on saving souls rather than changing the system. Religious orders established houses for repentant women, known as Magdalene homes or convents of penance. Here, women could confess, take vows, and begin anew under strict supervision. Some found peace there. Others found only another kind of captivity. Among the nobility, attitudes towards such women were often hypocritical. Wealthy men sometimes maintained mistresses while publicly supporting moral laws. Courtiers might sponsor poetry or songs celebrating fallen women as tragic figures, turning real suffering into entertainment. In these verses, the prostitute became a symbol, a warning, a temptation, or a reminder of sin. Yet beneath the moralizing, these stories reveal a quiet truth. Fascination with those who lived outside the rules was as old as the rules themselves. There were also those who tried to defend the humanity of these women. A few writers, especially later in the Middle Ages, argued that sin should not erase compassion. They pointed out that poverty, not wickedness, was often the true cause of their condition. Some even suggested that forgiveness and kindness could do more good than punishment. Though these voices were rare, they show that empathy, however small, existed even in a harsh and judgmental age. For the women themselves, survival required resilience. Many learned to read human behavior better than any scholar, to judge a man's mood, to negotiate, to navigate danger. Some saved enough to leave the trade and open small shops or inns. Others entered convents in repentance. Many more simply disappeared into history, their names unrecorded, their lives forgotten. Yet in every city, traces of them remain, in court records, in the faded ink of moral sermons, in the stone foundations of old streets where they once walked. The law's treatment of these women was a mirror of medieval society's contradictions. They were punished for existing, yet needed by the very system that condemned them. They were denied respect, yet depended upon to preserve it for others. The tension between sign and necessity defined their lives and reflected the broader struggle of an age that sought to reconcile faith with human frailty. In the quiet hours of night, when the taverns emptied and the city grew still, perhaps some of these women looked toward the same stars that guided the faithful and the noble. They, too, hoped for grace, for comfort, for a gentler world. And though the church may have seen them as symbols of corruption, they were, in truth, symbols of something far more enduring, the unbreakable will to survive, and the unquenchable need to be seen not as sinners, but as souls. Long before text messages and whispered phone calls, love found its voice in ink and song. In the Middle Ages, letters and poetry were not just forms of communication. They were acts of devotion, expressions of emotion, carefully wrapped in words. In a world where open affection was often frowned upon and privacy was rare, these written gestures allowed hearts to speak safely across distance and time. Whether exchanged between nobles separated by duty, monks writing to their patrons, or lovers daring to defy social barriers, the language of love flowed through quills and parchment, quiet yet powerful. The tradition of love letters in the medieval world had roots in both religion and romance. The Church had long used written correspondence to share faith and guidance, and that same reverence for the written word shaped how people expressed personal feelings. To write was to confess, to reveal the inner workings of the soul. A love letter, therefore, was not just an expression of affection, it was an act of trust. In an age when emotions were often hidden behind formality, a single page of honest feeling could hold more meaning than any spoken vow. Among the nobility, letter writing became a refined art. Courtiers learned the proper structure of romantic correspondence, often modeled on the rhetoric of classical Latin authors. A well-written letter might begin with humility, the lover presenting themselves as the servant of the beloved, followed by praise, confession, and a plea for mercy or attention. The tone was formal, yet tender, carefully balanced between passion and restraint. Many such letters survive, their ink faded, but their emotion unmistakable. They speak of hearts in turmoil, of longing and loyalty, of hope and despair in equal measure. Poetry, too, was one of the most beloved languages of love. The troubadours of southern France, followed by the trouvers of northern Europe and the Minnesänger of Germany, turned romance into an art form. Their verses were performed in courts, accompanied by music, and dedicated to noble ladies who were often far beyond their reach. These poets spoke of love as both joy and suffering, a noble struggle that purified the heart. Their words transformed emotion into something elevated, almost sacred. Love was no longer just a feeling. It was a discipline, a path to virtue, a test of character. For ordinary people, love letters were simpler, but no less meaningful. Most peasants could not read or write, but those who could sometimes dictated letters to scribes or priests. The tone was often direct and sincere. They spoke of missing a husband gone to war, or a wife waiting through a long winter. These letters were rarely filled with flowery language, yet their honesty carried its own poetry. They spoke of the small details of daily life, the harvest, the weather, the health of children, and ended with a prayer for safety and reunion. In those simple lines, love became something practical and steadfast, grounded in faith and endurance. The preservation of love letters depended on chance. Some were hidden away, never meant to be read by others. Some were lost in wars or burned by families seeking to protect reputations. But a few have survived in archives and manuscripts, revealing the deep humanity of their writers. In one, a young woman begs forgiveness from her lover for doubting his affection. In another, a knight promises to return from battle and marry the woman who waits for him. Their words are centuries old, yet they sound like something written yesterday, proof that love's language has always remained the same. Poetry in the Middle Ages was often filled with symbolism. The rose stood for beauty and fragility, the nightingale for longing, the heart for suffering and devotion. Lovers compared their pain to the turning of the seasons, their joy to the coming of spring. Even when expressing sorrow, the rhythm of the verses made emotion sound graceful, controlled, and dignified. This balance of passion and restraint reflected the ideals of the time, that love should elevate, not destroy, and that words could turn even heartbreak into art. Many of these poems were written in secret. A knight might send a verse to a lady whose hand he could never hold, or a woman might write lines of affection hidden within a prayer book. The risk of discovery was real, especially in courts where reputation meant everything. Yet that secrecy only made the words more precious. To write was to preserve a feeling that could not be lived openly, to give love a safe home in ink when the world outside offered none. In monasteries and convents, too, poetry found its place, though its focus was spiritual rather than romantic. Some monks and nuns wrote verses describing their love for God in language, so tender that it blurred the line between the sacred and the personal. These writings remind us how intertwined divine and human affection were in medieval thought. The same words used to describe a lover's touch could also describe the yearning of the soul for the divine. Love, in all its forms, was seen as a reflection of the same eternal mystery. One of the most enduring legacies of medieval poetry is the belief that words could transform emotion. To write about love was to give it shape and meaning, to turn something fleeting into something lasting. The poets knew that time would fade faces and memories, but ink, carefully placed on parchment, could endure. Through their verses, they gave immortality to the feeling that defined them. Centuries later, their words still carry warmth, reminders of hearts that beat long ago, but loved no less deeply than ours. In the candlelit quiet of a medieval night, a letter might be written by trembling hands, sealed with wax, and sent across miles of danger. Days or weeks would pass before a reply came, if it came at all. In that waiting, there was both agony and beauty, the shared understanding that love was worth patience, that silence itself could hold meaning. For some, these letters were the only connection they ever had. For others, they were the first step toward a union that defied distance and doubt. Through poetry and letters, the people of the Middle Ages gave voice to what could not be spoken aloud. They turned longing into rhythm, fear into beauty, and fleeting affection into eternal words. Even now, when we read those fragments of their hearts, we find ourselves reflected there, in their hopes, their faith, and their unending desire to be known and remembered through the gentle power of love expressed on the page. War shaped the Middle Ages as surely as faith did. It forged kingdoms, destroyed families, and dictated the rhythm of countless lives. For love and marriage, war was both an obstacle and a catalyst, separating those who longed for each other, yet also creating moments of passion, promise, and heartache that would echo through centuries. Nowhere was this more true than during the Crusades, when knights and common soldiers alike left their homes to fight in distant lands, carrying with them both devotion to God and memories of those they left behind. Marriage in a time of constant conflict was a fragile thing. Husbands could be called away at any moment, leaving wives to manage households, lands, and children in their absence. The long separations strained relationships, but also revealed their strength. Letters sent from the front lines were filled with faith and longing, pledges to remain true until the war was over. Many women waited years, some never seeing their husbands again. Yet their patience and endurance became quiet acts of heroism, honored in prayer and in song. The Crusades brought new dimensions to this story. When the call went out from the Pope in the late 11th century for Christians to reclaim the Holy Land, tens of thousands answered. They left not only for faith, but also for glory, adventure, and duty. Behind them, they left wives and betrothed women who faced uncertainty and fear. The Church promised divine favor for those who took the cross, but it also offered special protection to their families. In theory, their marriages were safeguarded by law and by faith. In practice, distance and time tested every vow ever spoken. Many crusaders saw their journey as both spiritual and romantic. They wrote of serving God and their beloved in the same breath, blending devotion to heaven and home into one cause. A knight might carry a token from his lady, a ribbon, a glove, or a lock of hair, tied to his arm as a symbol of loyalty. These tokens appeared often in songs and stories, transforming war into a stage for chivalric love. The knight who fought bravely did so not only for faith, but also for the honor of the woman who waited for him. It was an ideal as poetic as it was perilous. For women, the Crusades changed life profoundly. Nobles who remained behind had to manage estates, defend property, and make decisions usually reserved for men. Some became de facto rulers in their husband's absence, signing charters and commanding retainers. Their letters reveal intelligence, strength, and resolve. But for every lady of rank, there were countless ordinary women left to struggle alone. Many lost husbands and sons to war and never knew their fates. The songs of the time speak of widows waiting by the shore, of brides whose marriages ended before they began, of promises swallowed by the sea. Love during wartime was not always faithful or noble. Distance brought temptation, and the heart, even in the age of faith, was not easily governed. Some men took new companions abroad. Some women found comfort in others at home. The church condemned such betrayals, yet it also understood the realities of absence. Confession and forgiveness were always at hand, for even the most devout were only human. The shadow of war blurred the line between loyalty and loneliness. The poetry of the troubadours often reflected this tension. They wrote of women whose lovers had gone to fight, of longing so deep it bordered on despair. In one famous verse, a lady speaks to the wind, begging it to carry her words across mountains and seas. Another laments that her heart is torn between pride in her knight's bravery and the pain of his absence. These songs were not just entertainment. They were emotional outlets for a society where loss was constant and love, when found, had to survive both distance and time. For men returning from war, love was often complicated by change. Years away could turn familiarity into strangeness. Husbands came home hardened by violence. Wives aged by waiting. Some found comfort in reunion. Others discovered that time had eroded what once bound them. There were also new unions formed in the aftermath of war. Widows who remarried for stability, soldiers who married in conquered lands, love born out of survival rather than choice. Each of these stories revealed the same truth. War reshaped not only borders but hearts. Among the Crusaders, encounters with new cultures also transformed ideas of beauty and affection. Those who traveled to the Middle East returned with tales of elegant customs, perfumes, silks, and songs unlike any in Europe. These influences began to color Western courtship traditions. The refined manners of love that later defined chivalry were, in part, shaped by these encounters, a blending of East and West, of devotion and desire. Even in conquest, the exchange of culture left its mark on how people understood romance. The church framed war and love through the same lens of duty. To fight honorably was to serve both God and family. To remain faithful was to mirror divine constancy. Yet the reality was far messier. Beneath the ideals of knighthood and piety, there were tears, longing, and broken promises. War revealed both the strength and the fragility of human affection, how easily it could endure, and how easily it could be undone. Some of the most poignant stories of medieval love come from the edges of battle. A soldier dying on foreign soil, clutching a keepsake from home. A wife lighting a candle every evening, praying for a man who would never return. Lovers reunited after years apart, changed yet still bound by memory. These quiet moments, more than the glory of battle, reveal the true legacy of the Crusades, not conquest, but endurance. The Middle Ages were an age of contradictions. Faith and violence, purity and desire, love and loss. War tested them all. And though the sound of armor and the cry of banners may have faded long ago, the echoes of those who loved across distance remain. Their letters, their songs, and their prayers remind us that even amid chaos, love sought a way to endure, patient, fragile, and eternal, like a candle burning against the wind. The Middle Ages were not only an age of kings and knights, but also of stories, tales of love that lived in the imagination long after the people who inspired them were gone. In dimly lit halls and around crackling fires, storytellers wove the lives of real and imagined lovers into legends. These stories, whispered, sung, and written in manuscripts, reflected the desires, fears, and dreams of a world caught between faith and passion. They spoke of loyalty and betrayal, destiny and choice, showing how love could be both a source of strength and a path to ruin. Few tales captured the medieval heart more than that of Tristan and Isolde. Their story, told and retold across Europe, was the very image of tragic love. Tristan, a brave knight, and Isolde, the wife of his lord, were bound together not by choice, but by a potion meant for her wedding night. Their love, born of magic and doomed by circumstance, defied all laws of honor and faith. They met in secret, torn between duty and desire, and their fate was sealed not by their hearts, but by the world's judgment. For centuries, their story was seen as both a warning and a mirror, proof that love, no matter how pure, could destroy those who embraced it too completely. Another famous legend, that of Lancelot and Guinevere, carried similar weight. Lancelot, the perfect knight of Arthur's court, was devoted to Queen Guinevere, wife of King Arthur. His love for her tested every vow of loyalty he had ever sworn. Theirs was a love that united chivalric devotion and human weakness. It was forbidden, yet it ennobled him. When their secret was exposed, it brought down the glory of Camelot. In the quiet sadness of their downfall, medieval audiences saw a reflection of their own struggles, between faith and feeling, between what was right and what was irresistible. The story of Abelard and Heloise was different, for it was no legend at all. It was real, and because of that, it remains one of the most haunting. Abelard, a brilliant scholar, and Heloise, his gifted student, fell deeply in love in 12th century Paris. Their letters reveal a passion that was both intellectual and emotional, tender and tormented. When their affair was discovered, tragedy followed. Abelard was punished, Heloise was sent to a convent, and though their lives were separated, their hearts never were. The letters they exchanged after their separation are among the most moving in history, filled with longing, regret, and a love that endured even in renunciation. For medieval readers, their story blurred the line between sin and sanctity, showing that love could survive even when the body could not. Legends also arose around figures like Heloise and Abelard, but also fictional pairs like Romeo and Juliet centuries later, whose roots can be traced to earlier European tales of doomed young lovers. In every culture of the Middle Ages, French, English, German, and Italian, there existed some version of this theme. Love, when pure, was tested by society. When hidden, it was punished, and when fulfilled, it often ended in sorrow. Medieval love stories rarely offered happy endings, not because people did not believe in them, but because they understood that in a fragile world, joy was fleeting and precious. There were also stories of love that transcended life itself. In Arthurian legend, the Lady of the Lake and Sir Lancelot shared a bond of mystery and destiny. In Germanic myth, Siegfried and Brunhild's fiery devotion led to betrayal and revenge. In Dante's great vision of the afterlife, the Divine Comedy, love becomes divine itself, guiding the soul through heaven and hell. His muse, Beatrice, whom he saw only a few times in his life, became the symbol of eternal love, a reminder that the truest affection might not belong to this world at all. Even folk tales, told in villages far from the courts, carried the same echoes. A shepherd and a maiden separated by class, a miller's daughter and a soldier who never returned, a faithful wife who waited through years of war. These stories, passed down orally, were not about grandeur or nobility, but about endurance. They reflected the quiet courage of ordinary people who loved despite hardship, poverty, and the indifference of fate. Listeners saw themselves in those tales and found comfort in knowing that even the lowliest could feel emotions as profound as any king or queen. Love in these stories was often a moral lesson. It taught about loyalty, sacrifice, and the consequences of pride. But it was also a mirror held up to the heart, revealing how fragile and stubborn love could be. Storytellers understood that audiences needed both escape and reflection, that through tragedy they might find understanding. The lovers who suffered in their tales were not simply characters. They were symbols of what it meant to be human in a world where everything was uncertain except the heart's capacity to feel. The influence of these legends went beyond entertainment. They shaped how people spoke of love, how they wrote about it, and even how they experienced it. Knights modeled their behavior on Lancelot's devotion. Women dreamed of being loved with the passion of Isolde or Heloise. The ideals of chivalry and romance that defined later centuries were born from these medieval tales. They gave structure to longing, turning private feeling into shared language. And though centuries have passed, these stories still speak to us. They remind us that love has always been a fragile rebellion against time and circumstance, that it can lift or destroy, heal or wound, but never leave us unchanged. For the medieval mind, these stories were more than entertainment. They were truth hidden in poetry, glimpses of divine mystery wrapped in human emotion. When we think of the Middle Ages, we might picture stone castles and shining armor, but it is these stories of love that bring the past to life. They are the heartbeat behind the history, the songs behind the silence. And through them, we see that even in an age of hardship and faith, the most enduring quest was not for power or salvation, but for connection, the timeless search to love and be loved, no matter the cost. In the grand stories of the Middle Ages, love often belonged to the young, to knights on horseback, to maidens in gardens, to poets sighing over distant queens. Yet beyond those songs and stories, real life told a quieter, deeper tale. People grew old, lost spouses, and sometimes found love again. Aging, widowhood, and second marriages were as much a part of medieval love as the passion of youth, and in them the human heart showed a kind of endurance far stronger than fleeting romance. Life expectancy in the Middle Ages was short by modern standards, but many people did live into their 50s, 60s, or even beyond. Age was seen not as decline, but as a stage of wisdom and reflection. Still, the passing of youth brought changes to body, to spirit, and to social standing. For women especially, age could be both burden and liberation. A young woman's life was tightly controlled by family and husband, but a widow, though marked by sorrow, often gained freedom that few ever knew. Widowhood was a common part of medieval life. Wars, disease, and the dangers of childbirth made loss almost inevitable. When a spouse died, grief was both private and public. The church prescribed periods of mourning, during which black garments were worn and social engagements reduced. Prayers were said for the soul of the departed, and widows in particular were expected to live modestly and virtuously. Yet after the tears and rituals faded, life demanded continuation. Many widows managed estates, raised children alone, and became respected figures in their communities. In the absence of a husband, they discovered their own agency. For some, love after loss seemed impossible, a betrayal of memory. Many widows chose not to remarry, devoting themselves instead to piety and charity. They founded hospitals, funded churches, or entered convents to spend their remaining years in service and prayer. Their love transformed from earthly to spiritual, a devotion that reached beyond the grave. But others, moved by companionship, need, or hope, opened their hearts again. In doing so, they faced both opportunity and judgment, for the church's view of second marriage was cautious at best. According to church teaching, marriage was sacred, but not eternal in the same sense as the soul. Death ended the bond, and remarriage was permitted, yet it was considered a lesser union, more practical than holy. A widow who remarried too soon was often criticized for inconstancy. A man who did so was seen as hasty, perhaps even greedy. Despite this, second marriages were common. They united families, secured property, and offered emotional solace in a world where loneliness could be as sharp as hunger. For noble families, remarriage was often political. A widowed lord might take a new wife to produce heirs or strengthen alliances. A widow of rank could become a valuable match, her experience and estate making her desirable in ways beyond youth or beauty. These marriages were rarely romantic at first, yet they could evolve into companionship marked by mutual respect. Letters and chronicles from the time show couples in later life sharing warmth and affection, love tempered by age, less fiery but more enduring. Among the common folk, second marriages were practical necessities. A widower with children needed help to keep the household. A widow needed security and support. Matches were often arranged quickly, and affection came later, if it came at all. Yet in these unions, there was a kind of quiet realism that modern eyes might mistake for coldness. Love, when it grew, was built on shared labor and understanding rather than passion. In its own way, it was no less deep. The experiences of aging also changed how people understood love itself. Medieval writings on old age often described it as a time of peace and detachment, when the body cooled and the passions of youth gave way to wisdom. Philosophers and preachers spoke of this as a gift, freedom from temptation, a chance to turn one's thoughts to eternity. But those who lived it knew that longing did not vanish so easily. Companionship, affection, and touch remained powerful needs, even when life slowed and the world grew quieter. In that gentleness of later years, love became less about desire and more about gratitude. Widows and widowers who found new love sometimes faced criticism from their families. Children might fear for their inheritance or resent a step-parent who altered household dynamics. In towns and villages, gossip followed those who seemed too joyful too soon after loss. Yet time and again, people chose to begin again despite it all. They remarried, built new homes, and tried to reclaim a measure of happiness. Their courage to do so, to love after grief, was a quiet rebellion against despair. For some, second marriages brought redemption. Chroniclers tell of couples who found peace and understanding in later life that had eluded them in youth. Freed from the urgency of ambition and the intensity of first love, they learned to value patience, humor, and kindness. Their affection was steady, built not on fantasy, but on endurance. In their companionship, they found healing for the wounds of the past. Artists and poets sometimes depicted old age as barren of love, but just as often they hinted at its persistence. Medieval literature spoke of aged knights who still remembered the warmth of a distant smile, or widows who kept tokens of their first love long after the world had forgotten. The troubadours themselves, in their later songs, wrote less about passion and more about devotion that time could not erase. In their verses, love aged gracefully, becoming something gentler, not the fire of youth, but the steady flame that lights the last stretch of life. Even the church, stern as it was, recognized this softer love. Clerics sometimes described second marriages as a mercy, proof that God, knowing human loneliness, had allowed people to find comfort more than once. The idea of companionship, not just desire, began to gain spiritual value. Love was no longer only the spark of youth, but also the calm of shared faith and memory. In the candlelight of later life, love took on a different beauty. It was not marked by grand gestures or whispered poetry, but by simple acts, tending a garden together, praying side by side, sharing a meal at dusk. In those moments, hearts that had endured war, loss, and time found peace in each other's company. To grow old and still be capable of love was, perhaps, the truest kind of devotion the medieval world ever knew. For all its ideals of chivalry and youth, the Middle Ages understood something timeless. Love does not vanish with age. It changes shape, softens, deepens, and lingers quietly, even when words fall away. It becomes less about desire and more about presence, a reminder that in every stage of life, the heart still remembers how to care. When most people think of love in the Middle Ages, they imagine grand gestures, armored knights kneeling before noble ladies, or secret kisses in candlelit halls. These images, shaped by centuries of art, books, and films are beautiful, but they tell only a small part of the truth. Real medieval love was far less glamorous and far more human. It was built from labor, faith, loss, and endurance, not from fairy tales. The myths we still carry about romance in that time reveal more about our dreams than about their daily lives. Yet behind the myths, there is a story more honest, and in many ways, more moving. The first myth is that medieval love was filled with romance in the modern sense. In truth, most marriages were practical arrangements. Love might grow, but it was rarely the reason for union. Family alliances, property, and survival mattered far more. The idea of marrying for affection was almost revolutionary. Yet, within these marriages, people did find tenderness. Their letters, diaries, and even wills show traces of real affection. A husband thanking his wife for her loyalty, a wife praying for her husband's safe return. Love existed quietly, not as an escape from duty, but as something woven through it. Another myth tells us that knights and ladies lived in a world of constant courtship and passion. The reality was far stricter. Social barriers were high, and open affection between the sexes was closely watched. The courtly love celebrated by troubadours and poets was largely symbolic, a ritualized performance of longing, not a reflection of daily life. It was an ideal meant to elevate emotion, to make love seem noble and spiritual rather than carnal. Yet because of its beauty, later generations mistook it for reality. What the poets wrote as allegory, we now remember as truth. There is also the belief that medieval people were prudish or unaware of their own desires. In fact, they spoke of love and the body often, but in ways framed by religion and morality. They understood desire deeply, even if they feared it. Medical texts discussed its effects, preachers warned of its dangers, and poets described it in veiled but vivid language. The difference was not ignorance, but caution. To speak of love was to walk a careful line between holiness and sin. Their restraint was not coldness. It was awareness of the weight love carried in a world where every feeling seemed tied to the fate of the soul. Many imagine medieval women as silent figures, bound entirely by obedience. Yet in the realm of love, women often had more power than we assume. Noble women managed estates, chose suitors within limits, and sometimes refused marriages arranged against their will. In poetry, they became the arbiters of affection, the ones who granted favor or withheld it. Even among the poor, women shaped relationships through practicality, wit, and resilience. They were not always free, but they were never entirely powerless. Their quiet strength, recorded in letters and songs, shaped how love endured. Another enduring misconception is that passion in the Middle Ages was always tragic or forbidden. While many stories ended in heartbreak, Tristan and Isolde, Lancelot and Guinevere, real life held just as many examples of love that lasted. Husbands and wives who worked side by side for decades, widows who found companionship again, couples who raised children through hardship and prayer. Their love rarely made it into poetry, but it was the kind that built the world. It was steady, patient, and kind, the kind that left no trace except in the lives it sustained. The myth of chivalry itself is partly to blame for how we view medieval romance. The code of chivalry, as described in literature, bound men to serve women as ideals of virtue and grace. But in practice, it was more about loyalty, honor, and restraint than about love. Real knights were soldiers, often brutal and pragmatic. The stories of noble adoration came later, shaped by poets who wanted to soften the image of war. They turned the battlefield into a metaphor for the heart, transforming discipline and devotion into the language of romance. The result was beautiful, but it was never meant to be literal. Another misunderstanding lies in how we think of love across class lines. In truth, such unions were nearly impossible. Social boundaries were rigid, and marriage outside one's class could bring ruin. Yet the stories persisted because they offered hope. The belief that love could cross divides and make all people equal. In a world ruled by hierarchy, these tales gave people something to dream about, the idea that the heart might be stronger than rank or wealth. We also tend to believe that love in the Middle Ages was naive, untouched by complexity. But it was, in fact, deeply thoughtful. Philosophers, theologians, and poets all wrote about love as one of the greatest mysteries of existence. They debated whether it came from God or from human weakness, whether it led to virtue or to ruin. They saw in it a reflection of the entire human struggle between reason and passion, faith and flesh, duty and freedom. In their writings, love was not trivial. It was sacred and dangerous, capable of redeeming or destroying, sometimes both at once. Even the myth that medieval life was joyless misses something essential. Amid war, famine, and faith, there was laughter, music, and affection. Weddings were lively, songs playful, and lovers inventive. People courted at fairs, danced at harvest festivals, and exchanged tokens beneath trees or by rivers. They celebrated love with the same vitality with which they faced hardship. Their lives were difficult, but their hearts were not dull. They found meaning in moments of warmth, knowing how fragile those moments could be. In the end, the myths of medieval love survive because they speak to something timeless. We still long for devotion that feels noble, for affection that outlasts circumstance, for connection that feels destined. The difference is that we now separate fantasy from reality, while the medieval mind saw no such boundary. To them, love was both dream and duty, both the poetry of the soul and the labor of daily life. If we look past the myths, what we find is something simpler and truer. Medieval people loved as we do, clumsily, courageously, imperfectly. They wrote letters that trembled with feeling, held hands beneath church arches, waited for each other through long winters. They made mistakes, forgave, and tried again. Their stories remind us that love has never belonged only to poets or knights, but to everyone, to the farmer's wife, the soldier's widow, the monk who prayed in secret for peace in his heart. The myths endure because they capture the beauty of love's promise. But the truth endures because it tells us something greater, that love in every age is both fragile and eternal. It survives not in legend, but in the quiet moments that no one writes down, the same moments that keep the world, even now, a little warmer and a little more human. And so, as we come to the end of this journey through medieval love, we find something both surprising and familiar. The world of the Middle Ages may seem distant, filled with castles and cloisters, codes and commandments. Yet beneath it all, the same hearts beat that beat within us now. They loved in ways shaped by faith, by fear, by duty, and by the fragile hope that affection could make a hard life softer. They wrote of love as a mystery, a trial, and a blessing. They believed it could lift them closer to heaven or drag them into despair. But above all, they believed it mattered. To the people of that time, love was never simple. It was bound up with power, religion, and survival. It was a duty as much as a dream, a labor as much as a joy. And yet, through all the rules and rituals, through all the sermons and songs, they still found ways to express it. In a letter written by candlelight, in a shared glance across a crowded hall, in the warmth of hands joined in prayer. They may have lived centuries before us, but their stories remind us that the heart has always known the same language. When we strip away the myths of perfect knights and flawless ladies, we see people real, flawed, and deeply human. A farmer kissing his wife before another day in the fields. A noble woman writing secretly to the man she cannot have. A widow lighting a candle for a husband long gone. Love was everywhere, even in a world that tried to control it. It was the thread that tied people to one another, that made life worth enduring through all its hardship and uncertainty. And perhaps that is why these stories, still speak to us today. Because love, in the end, is timeless. It doesn't belong to one age or one kind of person. It is both frail and powerful, both fleeting and eternal. It changes with the world, yet it always feels the same when it finds us. Quiet at first, then all-consuming, then, sometimes, just a steady warmth that stays when everything else fades away. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine that world again. The candlelight, the stone walls, the songs carried on cold evening air. Imagine that somewhere in that distant time, someone sat by a fire, thinking of the person they loved, wondering if they would be remembered. In a way, they are remembered in every heartbeat that still believes in love's endurance, in every story that still tries to understand it. Thank you for listening to this episode of History for Sleep. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more gentle stories from the past to your nights. And before you go, take a moment to leave a comment. Tell me when you listen, what time of night you press play, and what parts of history you'd like to wander through next. For now, close your eyes. Let the echoes of old songs and soft voices fade into quiet. And remember, no matter the century, love has always been there, waiting, patient, and kind.